Good morning. My name is Wes Mukoyama. 2 days ago, I celebrated my 81st birthday, 5 or 6 months younger than Kenji Akahoshi, I must say. So I'm not the oldest one here. Um I was born and raised in Chicago as an evangelical United Brethren Methodist. And I was born during the war in 1942. I was born in a housing project, and then when we moved to a middle class neighborhood, we were picketed because we were Japanese. So my whole thing is my Japanese identity. I also have two older brothers who came back from Japan after the war. They were caught in the war, and their village was bombed. So. And when they came back, they didn't speak any English. And we were harassed by the Italian kids in our neighborhood. And they chased us from school to our home. But we stopped that by bringing out rakes from the backyard and chased them away. I remember a time when I was about 4 years old, and kids from another neighborhood were coming to our neighborhood, and they asked us, "What are you doing with a Jap in your group?" And one of my good meaning friends said, "Ah, leave him alone. He can't help it. He was born that way." I felt like a freak at that time, and wasn't very happy with my identity during my years. Finally, when I went to high school, I wrote a term paper and interviewed parents of my friends my new friends who were Japanese American, who were in camp. And they talked about this being sent to horse stalls, living in horse stalls temporarily with the smell of manure and hay residue in the stalls. And it just shocked me to hear that. And when my evangelical United Brethren minister upheld our neighborhood from blocking Black African Americans to move in our neighborhood, I became disillusioned with Christianity, and I left. And as Arturo said, I took world religions, and I studied Buddhism amongst them, and I learned a lot about Buddhism. Unfortunately, right after college, I was accepted to the Peace Corps. I went to Tanzania, East Africa. Prior to that, I worked as a aid worker, walking in the inner city slums to reestablish eligibility for families of dependent children, aid to families of dependent children. And the smell of ovens and hot weather, 90-degree weather, and talking to second generation African American families in receiving aid. And when I went to Africa, Tanzania, East Africa, for 2.5 years, I taught as a middle school teacher. And I really learned another culture that even though they were poor, living in huts, they had this dignity about them, and it was just wonderful teaching African students in middle school. And one of the highlights of that is Bobby Kennedy came to visit us in 1967, and he had lunch with us. And then after that, on the back patio, he asked us, "What have we taught the Tanzanian tribes?" And I said, I stood up and I said, "I learned more from them than they learned from me." And he says, "Well," and then he normally said, "When you go out and brush your teeth, you're teaching them dental hygiene." So it made me feel pretty good. I don't know about that. And so, but sadly, a year later, he was assassinated. And so was Martin Luther King. and so was Malcolm X, which important book I read by Alex Haley, by autobiography of Malcolm X, which got me into civil rights immediately. And in college, I worked in the inner city for the Congress of Racial Equality. And after that, I had the opportunity, after being in the Peace Corps, to live in Japan for a year and a half. And that's where I learned more about Buddhism. I lived near Reverend Gyomei Kobose, who was on leave from his temple. And we would go out and do zazen on weekends. And he was a great teacher for me. And during that time, I met my wife, and she was the number one influence. She's a member of Palo Alto Buddhist Temple. She came on a tour, and I met her, and a year later we got married. So when I returned to the United States, I worked in the inner city as a neighborhood worker. Then later on, after we were married, we moved to the Bay Area, and I've been living here for 50 years. And I joined the Palo Alto Buddhist Temple. And some people that really influenced me were Alfred Bloom, Glenn Komeda, of course, Kenji Akahoshi, and Reverend Will Masuda, and Hiroshi Abiko, and now Dean Koyama. And I worked for the VA for 30 years as a clinical social worker, learned a lot from the veterans, and my last 6 years before retirement, I was executive director of UIKAI, a Japanese American senior service center in San Jose. And I really enjoyed working with Japanese American elderly. And as I retired, because I wanted to be with my grandchildren, a member of the San Jose Buddhist Temple asked me if I wanted to volunteer in the jail. And I agreed to do so because I had been working with a lot of men at the VA, so I understand what people in jail, they have what we call post-traumatic stress disorder because of the crimes that they committed. And so he was my mentor, and I went with him and interviewed inmates, and a lot of them were interested in Buddhism. So I just want to say here, they would have to ask for us, so we didn't proselytize Buddhism, and we just responded to their requests. And in 2014, I started in 2009, so I've been almost there for 15 years, going there once or twice a week with now exclusively men, but I used to also counsel women. And in 2014, I started meditation classes. I got permission to do so. And that's what led me to study more about Buddhism. And I'll just say a few books that I read before I got into Buddhism was Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, and then with Reverend Kobose, I read his book Everyday Suchness, and the one that most influenced me about Jodo Shinshu was The Monk Who Dared, and by what's her name, Ruth something, I can't remember her name. And I really understood. I studied about Shinran Shonin's life, and it was very similar to mine. By 29, I became a Buddhist, and at that time, he left his temple and went to Honen and studied the Nembutsu. And so basically, that's where I've got a lot of my faith in Buddhism, knowing that I could never be a monk and never could achieve enlightenment, but to receive. And that was the greatest teacher for me. So my wife is here telling me so I like to, so I want to just say I've done a lot of things. I volunteer for the Red Cross in disaster mental health, and but the main, and I do facilitate family caregivers groups for the elderly, and I've been on many commissions. So at this point, I want to talk about two cases that I have in the jail. And I want to just say that that I want to differentiate between jail and prison. Jail is you're awaiting trial, and many of the people have misdemeanors or felonies. Most of the people I see are felonies with violent crimes, and a high percentage of them are accused of murder. So I meet with these men, and but I never ask them what their crime was, so I can see them as human beings, and that's very satisfying for me. And the two cases that I have, one is was very good. I met him when he was about 22, and in about 2014, and he was very interested in Buddhism, although his family was Buddhist, Vietnamese Buddhist, and he loved my meditation classes. And one of the things about meditations, I bring them in and talk about mindful meditation, and I say, you're going to be relaxed. And it's amazing, the transformation, even from first time people coming in, and they follow my meditation guide, and they really change, and they really are amazed at how relaxed that they feel. And that's what he felt. And then he kept on talking, wanting to see me individually. And I saw him weekly for about 2 or 3 years until he went to prison. And then we wrote to each other every 2 weeks. And I got him into he was the first one to get into the correspondence course at the Center for Buddhist Education. And he graduated after 2 years from there. And the thing was difficult because he doesn't have a computer while he was in prison. So we had to, the Center for Buddhist Education had to mail him, and they mailed it to his brother, who brought it to the prison, and he had to write his responses in pencil and then return it by post to the Jodo Shinshu Center. And he gradually became a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist, and he's now out. He got out in April, and he's doing very well. He's a program director for a homeless agency in Oakland, and I'm very proud with him. I saw him yesterday when he spent 2.5 hours at dinner at a Vietnamese restaurant, and he's written a poem that's in the Wheel of Dharma on freedom through meditation. That although he was in chains, his mind was liberated, and you'll see it in the November 2017 Wheel of Dharma. By the way, the other case I had was another Vietnamese man. He was older, and he was very traditional, and he had been meditating for 30 minutes. And so, anyways, to make a long story short, he finally told me he was hitting his head against the wall, and he was going to go to a court for violent outbursts in his unit. And I asked, and finally he admitted to me that he was hearing voices, and I said, and he couldn't sleep. So I said, I immediately thought he was psychotic. And so I tried to frustratingly contact the mental health. They didn't respond. And then finally, he was hitting his head against the wall, and the guard saw him and then sent him to mental health. And he spent the day overnight getting medication and a sleeper. And then when I saw him the next time, he was very sedated. And, and he said, "Do I have to stay this way?" And I said, "You probably have to take it for the rest of your life. And you really have to get adjusted to it." And it's been a year later that he's still on it, and I do see him, and he said, "Thank you, Wes." He says, "I don't hear the voices as much anymore, and I'm okay." But then he told me, this is the other side of he had 35 years to life in prison, and I I was I was really taken aback by that. And he says, "Wes, don't worry." He says, "I'm okay because I don't hear the voices as much, and I'm satisfied." So just about a few days later, I'm on the reentry commission, and I sat next to Judge Manley, who's a champion for the mentally ill, and trying to divert them from going to jail, because so many people who are mentally ill are in jail where they should not be. They should be getting treatment. And he said 35 years is too much for him. He said, because I wrote to his lawyer, Tony Serra, who's a famous lawyer, and thought that would get him, get him a lighter sentence because of his mental illness, and it didn't. And the Judge Manley told me he should get a lighter sentence because a new law has been passed. When I got to see him last Tuesday, the inmate told me, he said, "Look, the judge is calling me back. He's going to commute my sentence to perhaps 20 years. And he was very happy about that. And so gratitude comes in many, many ways. And I'm just trying to say Namo Amida Butsu and receive the wonderful things that come from all over. I say Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you. And I'm concluding my speech here.